Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series. Uncovering God in the creative arts. At the biggest international arts festival in the world, Sanctuary First stops to ask, where does faith and art meet?
And welcome to Faith at the Fringe, a Sanctuary First podcast series looking at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and where we can find faith there. And I'm joined today, I'm Albert Bogle, and I'm joined today with my colleague, Hannah Sanderson.
Hello, everybody.
And together we are going to be exploring what is chaplaincy all about in the arts in Edinburgh and also at the time of the Fringe. And I'm delighted that we have with us David Todd, who is in fact a chaplain set aside to simply be the chaplain to those involved in the arts in the Edinburgh area. So we're going to move over to you, David. Thank you for joining us. And I think, have I described that properly?
Yes, exactly properly. Thank you.
So listen, tell us a little bit about your background and why do you feel the need to be a chaplain to the theatres in the Edinburgh area?
So my background is in arts management. After I left university, I came to Edinburgh and was box office manager at the Traverse, then concerts manager of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra around the Queen's Hall. I managed the Academy of Music in London, and then I came back to be the first theatre manager at the Festival Theatre when it opened. So I had a sort of 20-year career as an arts manager in venues and with orchestras. And then for the last 20 years, I've been freelance as a consultant. My speciality was theatre catering, and because I set up all the bars and catering at the Festival Theatre and ran a restaurant at the Queen's Hall, and I've done some hotel management. So more recently, I decided that I felt a call to ministry. And when I became a lay reader, Greenside Parish Church were looking for a project in the arts, and I applied for it and became first chaplain to the Playhouse and to the Omni Centre, which is next to the Playhouse, so in the area of their church. And then from that, because I had worked in the theatres, I became chaplain at the King's, the Festival Theatre, and then at the Royal Lyceum Theatre.
So you've got a real inside track into how theatres work.
Yes, and that's quite important. In the workplace, in any workplace chaplaincy, you are looking after people while they're working. And if they're in need, then you're an asset. If they don't really need to speak to you, then you can get in the way. So my experience of working in the theatre helps me to know when I might be in the way and when I might not be.
So I suppose that leads me into the question then, that how do actors and theatre staff react to you as a minister being around them? I mean,
yeah. So it's quite interesting because I started as a lay reader. So I wasn't wearing a clerical collar. I mean, I had a badge that said I was the chaplain, and some people would ask, what is that? But at the last couple of years, I've been wearing a clerical collar, so I'm very noticeable. And in fact, there was a lovely occasion. We had the Rocky Horror Show at the King's, and people dress up for that show and heckle and things like that. And I went to meet the cast afterwards in my clerical collar, and they thought I was just dressed up for a sort of Vickers and Tarts party. So they know who I am, and they, I mean, theatre chaplaincy goes back a long way. It goes back to the late 19th century, when parish priests would help actors find accommodation. And there was a thing called the Actors Church Union that's now Theatre Chaplaincy UK. So a lot of theatres do have chaplains. A lot of them have parish priests who don't have a lot of time, maybe not as much time as I have. But people do know about chaplaincy and what they can offer. And our biggest offering really is for resident companies and for visiting companies, where people have problems that if they discuss them with their company manager, it might jeopardize their career. Whereas if they talk to me about them, I'm entirely neutral, impartial, and confidential.
Uh-huh.
I'm fascinated about this scene I can imagine in my head of you turning up to at the back of the Rocky Horror Show, and there could have been all kinds of gaffes, couldn't there? But it makes me think of a question that I wonder whether you've got an opinion on. The arts can sometimes be really on the edge, really pushing forward, really kind of saying things that have not been said before. You know, in the kind of Christian world, we might call that a kind of prophetic voice. I was listening to a Dawn French interview where she said, if we're not shocking, if we're not provocative, if we're not pushing those boundaries, then we're not doing art. Do you ever find, you know, a conflict around that? Or what would your opinion on that be?
So it makes me think of a musical that I was involved with about Burns. And the writer... I was there as a sort of audience consultant, and the writer used the C word in it, and I said, you can't do that in a musical. And then I was at the King's recently at a National Theatre of Scotland production of Orphans, when in the second song, the C word appeared in every single line.
Right.
I had to sort of think, you know, how does this work? And in fact, they used it so much it became ridiculous. But I think, I mean, I agree with Dawn French. I think one does have to, but there's also a value in just telling stories and helping people to realise where we are in the world.
Yes.
and in creation.
True.
So, thinking about all this then, you ever get this question you were asking, you wanted to ask?
Yeah.
Dave,
a bit of a weird question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in your opinion, is there a theatre person? Now, for people listening on podcasts, I have just done those inverted commas with my fingers, those theatre people. Do you see a difference? So at the Omni, you know, you're talking to people, maybe they're working in the restaurants, maybe they're selling tickets at the cinema, and then with your chaplaincy work at the theatres, perhaps you're interacting with actors, perhaps you're interacting with producers and stage managers. Do you see a difference in the personality type? Do you see a difference when interacting with creative people in the theatre? Do you see a difference in how they engage with the world, how they engage with perhaps spirituality? Is there a difference, or are all people the same?
Well, I mean, first of all, I deal with everybody, not just the actors. So the technical staff, the front of house staff are also part of my remit. And in the New Testament, Jesus often calls the Pharisees hypocrites, which in Greek is the word for somebody who pretends to be somebody that they're not. So actually actors were called hypocrites. And the people in first century Palestine didn't approve of theatre. Judaism didn't approve of theatre, but the Greeks did. And so when Jesus calls the Pharisees hypocrites, it's a sort of double whammy. He's being really rude because they would hate to be thought of as being... And of course, so actors, even today, have a lot of the time to pretend to be somebody that they're not, to take on the role. But when you meet them off stage, then I think they are like everybody else.
Yeah.
And they're an act. And in my experience... often comedians who you think are really funny can be quite morose and quite difficult off stage, and they are that's their other persona.
Yeah.
I think that's a good answer you've given, because I do think that sometimes we can put people on a pedestal if they're an artist or if they're for a particular profession, but what you're saying is that in reality, not most of us. Most people who are in different professions don't want to be put on a pedestal. They want to be seen as men and women who are also struggling with the problems of life and trying to make sense of it.
Well, they are. And I mean, particularly actors are out of work a lot of the time. Musicians have a slightly better, easier time because a lot of concerts are one-offs or short tours. But actors who are doing 6-week or even 6-month tours, trying to fit those in with other tours, can mean quite long times of unemployment. So it's not an easy life being an actor unless you're very successful. And even if you're very successful, it's not always easy.
Yeah. So does this give you, in this, that the kind of downtime, or when people have got time in between, shows, how do you go about doing chaplaincy work? Do you meet them do you say to people sometimes, can we catch up for a coffee outside of the work situation? Because I take it that there will be times when people want to talk to you about faith issues, and in the theatre there and then that might not be the place to do it.
There are two categories. There are the visiting companies, which the Playhouse, the King's and Festival Theatres have touring companies who are here for a week or two, maybe a bit longer, but that sort of time. And I would go along and meet them when they arrive, meet them after the first night, meet the company manager, and introduce myself and say, I'm around. If you need me, give me a call. So I can, and the Lyceum, when they set up a company, I go to the meet and greet and am introduced, and then my contact details are in the theatre. And then there are the resident companies, and so somewhere like the Festival Theatre, I can go in on a regular basis and sit in the cafe, and people will come and speak to me, or they'll ask me to come in. To meet somebody. So, in a way, it's quite a big congregation, so I can't keep in touch with them all the time. But, I sometimes feel, particularly when I'm going into the cafe, I wonder if anybody will speak to me, and will I be disappointed if nobody does? On the other hand, if nobody does, that also means that there's no need, that they're all on an even keel and happy. So it's a sort of a funny dichotomy of knowing, wanting to be helpful, but then if nobody needs help, that's surely a better situation.
Yes, of course.
That gave me an interesting glimpse there into what you were saying there about the this travelling actor. You become almost like in some ways, you're like a trusted fixer, that if there's something locally that they don't know about, but they can come to you and ask about it, or get information about something at a local level, you're someone they can trust.
Yes, exactly. I can, if they need specialist help here in Edinburgh as a chaplain, I have a list of contacts, because I'm not trained to do very much more than listen. But as we know, listening, it can be as important as anything else. Mm-hmm. But I recently had a meeting with Equity about the sort of relationship and how that works. The chair of Equity now is Maureen Beattie, a Scottish actor whose father, Johnny Beattie, was a famous variety star. Yeah. And we had a great chat, and she's really interested, particularly post-pandemic, in the well-being of actors, and she sees chaplaincy as a valuable resource to offer support in, as I said before, in a non-judgmental way.
Yeah, I mean, David, I must be honest and say, surely also as people who know the Lord Jesus and know how Christ has changed our lives and how Christ cares for the lonely, the weak, the desolate, but also wants to rejoice with those who are rejoicing. Isn't it a great privilege to sometimes to be able to talk about Jesus as well? That I would imagine as a chaplain you want to do that, although when you're invited to do it, is that not a great joy to do?
So it is, and I mean I don't do it unless I'm invited to do it. The Theatre Chaplaincy UK has a policy of proselytizing.
Easy for you to say.
I can't even say it. Never mind, do it. And so I would only respond to somebody that asked. But what I am doing all the time is showing the love of God to everybody, and very clearly in the theatre to people of any faith or none. And some people say people of all faiths, but I don't know very many people who are of all faiths.
No,
but I know people of any faith or none. And I mean, a lot of my work is with people who are not of the Christian faith. But I'm still there. I'm a presence showing the love of God.
Yeah. I think, can I tell you a story? This is connection that I think is relevant. I have a nephew who was involved with the counselling, and like you, he was not allowed to talk about his Christian faith. But what was driving him was the love of God for the people he was counselling. And he once told me he was counselling a a drug addict who was struggling with getting through his addiction. And, Jonathan said to him, you need to face the truth about yourself. And once you face the truth about yourself, that will set you free. And Jonathan said, the guy looked at him and he said, that's absolutely brilliant, Jonathan. Where did that all come from? And he was able to say, Jesus of Nazareth. The truth will set you free. And so there are opportunities, aren't there, where we can speak the truth and it touches people's lives because the Spirit of God picks these words up, doesn't he, and changes people.
Yeah.
I just do think that we need to never underestimate that sometimes the opportunity to be direct about faith as well.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we just need to take the risk.
Says the born evangelist here.
But in a kind way, in a loving way, not ever in a way that's judgmental, as you said.
So one of the things that I've done, not always in the Fringe, but definitely in the rest of the year, is to ask theatre management to give me free tickets for refugees. And I've been working with Syrians and Afghans mainly until recently when I've been working with Ukrainians. And there was one time I got tickets for the pantomime and I wasn't able to be there. I normally welcome the refugees, give them their tickets, and then I have a budget to give them an ice cream in the interval. And they just love it. They love coming to the theatre, and particularly to children's shows. The children have good English and understand, and they know about Peppa Pig and Paw Patrol and things like that. And this time I couldn't come to the pantomime. I said to the theatre, will somebody look after them? And they put on an extra member of staff just to look after these guests. So there were 30 people perhaps. And that member of staff did what I did. And then they said, we could look after that in the future. And I said, well, no, actually, I quite like doing it because it gets me into the theatre, not just hanging around, but actually doing something practical and proactive. A lot of chaplaincy is just being there if you're needed. But if you're not there all the time, then when you're needed, they won't know.
Of course, they won't be reminded of you.
Yeah.
And,
So the biggest job I ever did was during the International Festival, and I got a call from one of the theatres. They had a company from Australia, and one of the lead actor had a heart attack and gone into a coma. And they were in their early 50s, and the company was in shock. And I was called to a company meeting to look after them. And the really interesting thing was, well, there were two interesting things. One, the company was part of Western descent and part of Aboriginal descent, and they flew an Aboriginal counsellor over from Sydney to be with them. And I looked after those of Western descent. And the company meeting it made me realise how different we all are. In Britain, if there was a company meeting like that, it would be to decide who was going to take the role and how the show was going to go on. For the first half of this meeting, which probably lasted 2 hours, there was no question that they were going to do the show. They were in grief. Their friend was dying, and she did die in Edinburgh. And then very, very gradually, some voices started saying, well, we've come halfway around the world. It's quite a big story to tell. It was part of Australian history and relationship between Westerners and Aborigines. And so eventually they did work out a way of telling the story. But I was fascinated that they put their friend, before the show.
I'm interested in, you told us a little bit at the beginning about, you started off working with orchestras and theatre management and bars, which is always fun, and things like this. And then obviously you then said, and then I got the call as to, to use jargon to enter ministry. And so therefore you're in a unique position. We've had lots of wonderful podcasts with brilliant artists, giving us the artist's perspective on faith. But you're both worlds for us. You're straddling both worlds. And I'm wondering here, this podcast is about finding the spirit of the creative God in the creative arts as they descend and flourish in Edinburgh. What do you personally think the role of creative arts is in faith and in God's story?
Well, they're part of creation, and everything is interconnected. I mean, we now know that the ratios that apply in harmony, in music harmony, are the same ratios that apply in astronomy, in anatomy, in architecture. I mean, everything in the world is created, and the more that science develops, the more we realize how very interconnected we are. So they're sort of there's a very, very close relationship. And I don't know if this quite, my experience with the orchestra, for example, I had to do a funeral of one of the orchestra from that I'd known for 40 years. And his widow said, I don't want all this resurrection business. But, as a musician, he'd played in the Matthew Passion and Messiah, in the C minor Mass of Mozart, the B minor Mass of Bach. You cannot, in the arts, ignore religious music, faith music, Christian music. In fact, I went to a concert the other day here, where the main part of there was BBC singers, and they sang a mass setting by Frank Martin. They sang introits by Mendelssohn, and it was, and it wasn't billed as a religious event, but there's nothing more religious than a mass setting. So they sort of can't. I can't separate them in my mind. And I was brought up in a Church of Scotland manse. My father was a minister. And so church going was always something that, we had to go to church. And when I came to Edinburgh, I joined the choir of St Giles Cathedral, and I sang every Sunday for 30 years. And so all the time I was going off touring with orchestras or running the theatre or the Queen's Hall, every Sunday I was in church. And so when I became freelance and was juggling all sorts of different things, I sort of wrestled with what should I do? And the one constant thing, the thing that was sort of most important in my life was my faith and that regular worship. And for me, worship is public worship is really important, and it's not unlike theatre in many respects. So I decided that I felt a call to ministry, and I'm particularly interested in liturgy and worship, and the chaplaincy is actually a nice sort of balance to that, because that's all to do with pastoral work, but also facing a community that's not necessarily Christian at all. In fact, a huge number of them aren't, and a huge number of them are of other faiths. I mean, the refugees I've taken to the theatre are mostly Muslim. So when I started, they couldn't come because it was Ramadan. Right. So it's only recently with the Ukrainians in Edinburgh, I took 40 of them to see The Lion King. And it was very, very, so there were children aged between 6 and 15 and their mothers, mostly living in hotels. And the story of The Lion King, and I don't think it's a spoiler alert because everybody... so Simba, the son, is banished because he's accused of murdering his father. And he makes friends with a water buffalo and a meerkat in a foreign land. And they eventually persuade him to go home. And the poignancy of his homecoming was not lost on these refugees who are all hoping to be back home at Christmas. It was very moving, actually.
Very.
So here's a question to think as we come to round up our podcast today. How do we link ministry back into your ministry of what you've been doing for these years back into the church? And is there a missional learning that the church can have from someone like yourself who's been involved with the arts? And how do you get that message back into the church, if there is a message there?
Well, I wouldn't presume to tell the church how to organise its business. But I do think that I am able to represent the church, but more to offer the love of God in the workplace to people who would struggle to come into a church. And so being out there amongst them, and okay, I'm not going to touch them all, but even if you touch a few, that is building a relationship. And I don't have a building, so I did a baptism recently in a private house, and that's not generally done in the Pisky Church. nor I think in the Church of Scotland.
No.
But I explained to the local rector and to the bishop that my congregation aren't church people, but if they want their child to be baptised, then who are we to say, oh no, you've got to come in? And actually, it was wonderful because it was in a private room, in the sitting room of their house. The little girl, she knew everybody there, and we were able to create a very gentle atmosphere, something that would have been much harder in a big church. And so I was able to connect, and I haven't yet done a wedding, but I've done funerals in the arts. So I think, and I hope that the church will recognise that chaplaincy in all its forms, not just theatre chaplaincy, is a way of spreading the love of God and the message of Jesus without having to heat a building.
Yeah. Well, of course, Sanctuary First is very much in that vogue, in that area, and I do also share the idea that we have people who come and ask, could their child be baptised, or could we conduct a wedding or a funeral? And you're always there to try and see if we can connect with, because of the Church of Scotland's parish system, we can usually connect through a parish to make all that happen for someone. One more question. How do you keep in touch with people who have been with you and you have maybe given pastoral guidance to? How do you keep in touch with them over the following months and years?
Well, with a lot of them, it's not easy, and one hopes that one's been of help while they've been in Edinburgh, and then when they move on. But I've now been a chaplain for 7 years, and I was in the theatre for about 20. So, I mean, I do get to know people, and although I said that during the Fringe, I'm not as busy as I am at some other times, because everybody's going to 23 shows a day, and they don't have time to speak to me. But a lot of people come to Edinburgh, and I actually find myself a lot of the time during the festival going out and meeting former colleagues, people that I've met in the past, and it's a wonderful magnet that it brings them all back to Edinburgh at this time.
Can I thank you very much for being with us today and for sharing in this podcast. And I don't know if there's anything you would like to maybe just say. How would people, if someone's listening into this and they're in the theatre world or in the arts and they're looking for support, how would they go about connecting and contacting you?
Good question. So in all the theatres of which I am chaplain, my contact details are there backstage and front of house. There are little posters giving people details. As far as the wider acting world, I don't know how. Well, they could get in touch with me through Theatre Chaplaincy UK. And actually, I have had 2 visits out of the blue from young people who wanted to be theatre chaplains, who had come to me through that route.
Wonderful.
So that obviously works.
Good. We just wanted to give you that opportunity for
thank
a
you.
bit of a publicity, because everybody's been getting a bit of publicity for what they do, and you deserve the same
Well, that's very kind.
opportunity. And one other thing we've been doing is, at the end of each podcast, we've been asking and thanking those who've been listening in to giving us the time to listen to this podcast, which has been really interesting, but also to thank you, the listener, and also we would like to say a blessing, just to be with you. God might be with you and strengthen you, whatever your circumstances are. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace, now and always. Amen.
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 Thank you for listening and watching. Until the next time, God bless and have a good day.